Hello again everyone, welcome back to the channel. Now before we start today's video, this week's episode was going to be about Maiden Castle, in relation to my recent video on Dorchester that I produced last week. However, sadly on Sunday morning my wife's grandfather passed away, and I wanted to make something in his memory. He was a very thoughtful and spiritual man, so I've chosen a subject that I hope he would have appreciated. So I hope you will join me as we explore a lesser-known tale of Roman Britain, its first bishop, Aristobulus. Aristobulus is very interesting. His name only appears once in the New Testament, yet over the centuries it would be said that he travelled across the Roman Empire, made his way across the Channel and became Britain's first bishop. According to Christian tradition, Aristobulus is meant to be one of the 70 disciples chosen by Jesus to spread his word, and after the events of the Gospels, he's meant to have left the Eastern Mediterranean, made his way across the Roman world, where he found himself in Hispania, where he preached to the Romanized locals. From there, Aristobulus is meant to have crossed to the British Isles, with some sources even suggesting he went to Ireland, setting up the first Christian footholds there. But regardless, he's meant to have preached to the local Celtic community of Britain, as well as the Romans who had settled there, but always as a solitary figure. There were no organised churches or clergy at this stage. From there, he's meant to have made his way to the area around Glastonbury, where he's meant to have died a peaceful death, although some suggest he actually died a martyr's death in Wales. But regardless, he's supposed to have died somewhere on the western side of the British Isles, leaving a spiritual legacy that would be picked up by medieval writings and inspire claims of Britain's apostolic origins. Over time, these stories were incorporated into the lists of the 70 disciples and lists of early bishops, giving him a formal title, the first bishop of Britain. The specifics of his time in Britain are almost certainly legendary. However, it does paint a vivid picture of how later generations imagined Christianity spread to the far western part of the Roman world. Alongside this tradition, later writers would attribute other identities to Aristobulus. Some said that he was the brother of Apostle Barnabas, and others would claim that he was the figure Zebedee, and some even claimed he was the brother-in-law of Apostle Peter. The Claudian invasion of 43 AD established Roman control over the southeast of Britain. Beyond the frontiers, resistance continued, but Roman towns, Roman forts, Roman roads, they were all starting to appear. And across the entire province, the religious landscape was richly varied. The Britons practiced their own form of Celtic polytheism, gods of rivers, gods of groves, gods of war, gods of healing. The Romans brought their gods, Jupiter, Minerva, Mars, and the rest of their pantheon, along with mystery Eastern cults, household gods, and also the imperial cult based around the emperor himself. What we don't see in this period of time is an organised Christian presence. There's no archaeological evidence, no inscriptions, no Christian symbols, and certainly no bishops. Christianity would make its way to Britain, but it hadn't done yet. And it certainly didn't do it in the form of apostolic missionaries or established church leaders. So if Aristobulus did make his way to Britain in the 1st century AD, it would have been a place completely unfamiliar with Christianity. And it certainly would have been a place that didn't have the institutional framework that later medieval writers assume that it had. The first appearance of the name Aristobulus comes from Paul's letter to the Romans in the New Testament, written in the 1st century AD, and it reads, "Greet those who belong to the household of Aristobulus." This is a tantalising detail, but a rather limited one. We're not really told anything about this Aristobulus. We're not even told whether he's Christian. Perhaps it's just his household who were members of the early church. There's no mention of any travelling, let alone to Britain, but later writers would attribute this Aristobulus as being one of the 70 or 72 disciples mentioned in Luke's Gospel. So from 1st century scripture, we only have a name, but that name would become the basis of an entire British legend. The idea of Aristobulus as Britain's first bishop doesn't come from Roman Britain. It comes from later Christian writers putting together lists of early missionaries long after those generations had passed. And one of our earliest texts that mentions Aristobulus in Britain is attributed to a bishop called Hippolytus of Rome. The problem is, our earliest surviving text of Hippolytus was written centuries after he had died, and its authorship, as a result, is dubious. But in that text, it describes Aristobulus simply as Bishop of Britain, with no explanation or corroboration. Another one of our main sources on Aristobulus comes from Dorotheus of Tyre, dated around the 6th century AD. It also describes Aristobulus as Bishop of Britain, but again, it's not strictly a historical record. It's another list of the 70 apostles, written centuries after the period it's describing. By the Middle Ages, the idea of Aristobulus in Britain had firmly taken root, offering prestige and antiquity and a sense of Christianity, making its way to Britain long before it had made its way to other places in the West. But why was Aristobulus chosen as Britain's first bishop? Well, it will have been partly because he appears in Scripture, a vital requirement for medieval claims of apostolic authority. It'll also be partly because there was no established tradition for early Christianity in Britain, leaving a bit of wiggle room for narrative invention, and it also meant that Britain could connect itself directly to 1st century Christianity. Now let's step into the world of speculation. Could someone from the Eastern Mediterranean have travelled all the way to Britain? Well, technically, yes. The Roman world was interconnected. People travelled from Judea to Rome, Egypt to Gaul, Syria to Spain. Britain was distant, but not unreachable. However, this possibility is not evidence, and when we look for evidence, we simply can't find any. So if Aristobulus isn't Britain's first bishop, who was? Well, our first piece of solid evidence comes from the 4th century AD and the Council of Arles, where 3 bishops are said to have attended: Eborius, Restitutus, and Adelphius. And during this time of Constantine, Christianity had taken root in Britain. It was organised and real. So what do we learn from Aristobulus, if not historical fact? Well, what we do learn is how later writers tried to weave Britain's story into the story of Christianity. We also learn how people on the far reaches of the Roman Empire saw their origins, and we see how legends can grow from the tiniest of seeds. But thank you very much for watching. Please remember to like, comment and subscribe. It helps immensely, and I'll see you on the next one. Ciao for now.